Welcome to the Green Urbanist, the podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello everyone, today's episode is a conversation with Dr. Helen Pineo. Helen is an urban planner and associate professor in healthy and sustainable cities in the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment at University College London. Her research focuses on how property development, regeneration and urban policy can support health and sustainability. She contributes to the evidence base about why and how to do healthy urbanism by using transdisciplinary approaches and amplifying the needs of underrepresented communities and the planet. Her book, Healthy Urbanism, Designing and Planning Equitable, Sustainable and Inclusive Places, redefines the meaning and form of healthy urban environments. In this episode, we talk about Helen's new book, Healthy Urbanism, and why she wrote it, the importance of considering planetary health and ecological health in relation to human health and well-being, some examples of healthy and sustainable urbanism in buildings from across the world, and the need for alternative funding models to deliver healthy urbanism. Helen has a really holistic and interesting perspective on health and well-being. She goes beyond maybe the basic stuff you hear about, needing to have clean air, etc., which is of course important and we all know. She also goes on to discuss the intersection of climate change and climate adaptation with health, the importance of affordability for our health. If you're interested to read her book, to buy a copy of her book, just know that you can get a 40% discount through the end of March 2023. So if you're listening to this episode just as it's coming out, you have a chance to get that book at a huge discount. If you go to the publisher's website, which is in the episode description, and you use the coupon code HIGHLIGHTS22, all caps, again, that's in the episode description, so just have a look there. You can get that discount. So that's just something Helen wants me to flag up. The other thing to say is that we talk about a lot of visual stuff in this episode, funnily enough, it being about urban design and buildings. We talk about case studies, and she discusses, a diagram that she uses to explain healthy urbanism. So it's really useful if you go into the episode description and follow a link to my Substack. I have a companion blog post to this podcast episode that has visuals of the stuff we talk about. That's really nice to be able to see a visual as you're listening to this episode. So do click on that as you're listening, and consider subscribing to the Substack to get access to other articles and stuff that I write that might be of interest to you. The final thing to say is, if you're enjoying the podcast, if you're getting some benefit from it and you want to support it, do consider sharing this episode or any episode with a friend or a colleague. Rate the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening. And if you want to chat, you can go to my website and send me a message or follow me on social media. I would love to hear from you. So for now, enjoy this episode, this conversation about healthy urbanism with Helen Pineo. Thank you so much, Helen, for joining me. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So people will have heard the sort of introduction, your sort of general bio in the introduction. So I'd love to start with a question I'm starting to ask my guests, which is, please tell us about a space or a place that is special to you, that you think works well, and tell us what's so good about it.
Yeah, I really love this question. I think it's a great kind of warm up to get to know people, because it says so much about where you like to spend your time and what you like to do. When I was first looking at it, I guess because I'm in a space right now where, I've been living in London for the last 16 years, but my family and I have just moved to Seattle, Washington for the year. I'm doing a visiting scholar placement at the University of Washington. And so when I think about places and spaces, I'm definitely in this space where I'm reflecting a lot, looking back to London, missing it and feeling homesick, but also thinking about this place where I grew up and how much it's changed and what it looks like now. I didn't actually grow up in Seattle. I grew up in Eastern Washington, which is much more rural environment.
Okay. And
so when I think about places, I often think of landscapes and, natural environments that I grew up around, ponderosa pine trees and the Palouse Hills, which were shaped by glacial processes and floods. And so, but from my healthy urbanism perspective and having lived in cities for pretty much all of my adult life, there's so much to say in terms of how they affect our health and well-being. And I'm now spending a lot of time thinking about a city like Seattle versus a place like London. And I look back on where we lived in Hornsey in North London, which is just kind of the ideal environment for a city. And so I think it's a great place to focus as like this place that is meaningful to me, because it says so much about how we can design places that are good for health and well-being. So the street that we lived on in London, we do still live on, but we're not there right now, is a row of terraced houses, fairly small. So less than an individual house being less than 100 square meters or less than 1,000 square feet. And they have small back gardens and small front gardens. And the streets are quite wide, big pavements, and lined with street trees. And the trees provide shade for the front gardens and the houses. And they are a wonderful environment for building a sense of community and a sense of social connection. They feel very safe to walk around. There's street lights in the evening if needed. They're very well maintained as well. So even comparing to what I see on the pavements here, the local authority were often coming and making sure that any kind of, uneven sidewalk issues were remedied very quickly. So that space, just starting from the street level, it was a wonderful place to raise our two kids over the last 10 years. And then kind of broadening out to the wider neighborhood that we lived in. Very walkable, lots of cafes, parks, schools, buses, many buses going into central London or other areas you might want to go to nearby. Probably the definition of the 15-minute neighborhood or the 15-minute city that we hear about so often in kind of urbanism circles at the moment. And also access to trains, no tube, but that was fine. You didn't need it. And, it's a really dense urban environment. People drove cars and there were cars on the streets, but it didn't feel very unsafe. And it's interesting comparing that to Seattle, where I'm living now, which is a very progressive West Coast city where actually it still doesn't feel very safe to walk and cycle around in many parts of the city. Yeah, I was surprised by that. I really didn't expect it because I used to cycle when I went to university here, and I don't remember, feeling particularly uncomfortable. But even comparing Seattle and London, even though London's much bigger, London has actually does feel a little bit safer for pedestrians and cyclists, maybe because it's more common there. But I think another thing I would just pick up on in that kind of moment of comparison is thinking about how, even though, reflecting back on my neighborhood in Hornsey, a beautiful area, very walkable, and from a healthy urbanism perspective, just has so many benefits to it. The environment doesn't necessarily determine everything, right? So there is one thing I can reflect on between these two places, which is that culturally in this part of London, and probably lots of parts of London, it's not considered safe to let your kids walk around outside by themselves. And I remember when my daughter started reception about, I guess it was 3 or 4 years ago. I'm losing track because the system over here is a little different. The head teacher told us that kids wouldn't really normally it wouldn't be acceptable for them to walk to school until about year 5 or so. And even though we only lived a couple hundred meters from the school, I remember thinking, wow, that's a shame, because I was allowed to ride my bike to school growing up, even from around, let's say 8 years old. And the difference in London and the difference over time was that it wasn't considered culturally acceptable. And then it's quite odd because here in Seattle, kids are doing it from a younger age. And so we're here in 2023, in two cities, which you might think that the same cultural factors would apply, that that both places would find it acceptable. But there is a difference, and so those kind of behaviors and things change how even a space which is on the face of it very safe for kids to walk around in London wasn't considered safe to do so for a number of reasons. But yeah, I think I'm looking back on it with a lens of a bit of homesickness, and also you have that tendency to compare when you find yourselves moving around, which is kind of a good thing, I think.
I think that's a really interesting comparison. Thanks for that. And do you think, having grown up in the countryside, that has given you a different reference point for what's a good urban place?
Yeah, I mean, I have moved around a lot. So after university, or even during university, I did. I started off with some study abroad trips to Italy, and I loved it so much. I just kept going back, and I lived in Rome and Florence and Perugia and a very small hill town. And so I saw that side of urban environments, and architecture had a huge impact on me. And I tried to stay as long as I could. And then I actually went and lived in Japan for a year as well. So I saw a whole different style of cities and development. And so I've had those different experiences, and certainly traveled a lot for work. And so I see the huge benefit in being able to build a sense of social connection and a sense of community in a city. And I think rural environments and smaller villages and towns, you can also have that. But moving into them as somebody who's new, it's not easy to kind of break into those environments. Whereas moving into a city like London, I found there were plenty of opportunities to do that.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think this probably segues nicely into our topic of discussion today, which is that quite recently, a couple of months ago, you published a book called Healthy Urbanism. Can you tell us what is the premise of that book, and why did you write it?
Yeah, so Healthy Urbanism was my response to a kind of, I felt, a lack of understanding amongst built environment and public health professionals about how the built environment impacts health. And I think I was drawing a lot on my experience before I became an academic. I worked in the building research establishment outside of London, and prior to that in the local government association in the planning advisory service. So I had experience working across local authorities around England, but also later through kind of consulting and advisory work, doing even international advisory work in urban planning. And so in those experiences, it was my impression that when we talked about healthy built environments, we were talking about enabling people to have a healthy diet or to get physical activity in their day-to-day life. So it was a lot of focus on healthy lifestyles and supporting people to make healthy choices. And I think that kind of thinking and that focus on lifestyles and choices hasn't been what we need to understand in order to create cities that support health. I wanted to broaden our thinking. I think it's been too narrow over the last few years. I think that's been happening, that so many conversations as a result of climate change impacts, even the pandemic and social movements that we've had have broadened our understanding about how the built environment affects our well-being and our health. And so I think that's a really good thing. And the book is trying to give us a summary of the evidence base about how the built environment does affect health at multiple different scales and for different people. But then also going through and looking at the different design and policy principles that we can use to support health, and lots of case study examples about how that's been done in different places. It does, as I said, it does draw on my experience. So it tends to be in the global north. A lot of the examples come from the UK, the USA, Australia, but there are other examples and discussion about global south settings as well.
Actually, that's an interesting question. Do perceptions around health or definitions around health differ in those different cultural contexts?
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think that it kind of picks up on a point of what we understand culturally to be health and well-being, and how it's influenced. And certainly in in global north countries, we have been driven quite heavily by a biomedical model of health. So thinking that our health is primarily influenced by our individual, genetic makeup and things we've inherited, but also our day-to-day habits in terms of smoking and diet and alcohol. These are all really important factors, but there are a huge range of other factors outside of those, which we also call those the social determinants of health or the wider determinants of health. And we have tended in many countries, say Western countries, we've tended to underemphasize those other factors. And I think part of that is deliberate, because by focusing on those biomedical models, the discussion, the narrative is led by organizations that have a stake in that game. They could be pharmaceuticals, it could be healthcare industry, but it can also be commercial determinants where they're saying, focusing on our individual lifestyle factors and genetic makeup takes the focus away from broader factors like climate change impacts on health, right, or even in some cases, smoking and sugar through the narratives that those organizations would lead with. So I don't know if I could say that other cultures that I haven't studied or understood as well have, to what extent they have a more holistic understanding of health. And it's very possible, and I think interesting to think about how that would affect our built environment decision making and what kinds of spaces we would design if we did take a more holistic approach to understanding health and well-being. And I think we're starting to move in that direction where we are, coming from places like the UK and the US.
Yeah. And so for your work, do you have a sort of a go-to definition for health that you use?
Yeah, so a lot of people would draw on the World Health Organization definition of health, which focuses on the absence of disease and a complete state of health and well-being. And that definition has been criticized, constructively criticized for a number of reasons. Because if you think about it, for example, a lot of people live on a day-to-day basis with chronic diseases, chronic conditions that they won't be able to completely get rid of, but they may still feel healthy, that they may feel that they're able to live a healthy life and day-to-day basis have good well-being. And so is it appropriate to say that they don't have health if they don't have a complete state of health? So that's one of the examples. And I think a more holistic definition of health that I provide in the book thinks about our capabilities to deal with the issues that we are faced with in life and the resources that we can draw upon to face those challenges. And so sometimes they may be, a virus. So it could be thinking about it from an infectious disease perspective and what kinds of capabilities and resources we have to face that virus. Can we rest? Can we get good, hydration? And can we wash our hands to stay safe and to keep other people safe around us? Those kinds of factors. But it could also be in relation to something more like a mental health resources. Do we have the mental health resources to also rest would be important, but social connection and other factors that within our wider environment that may help us to deal with any kinds of stressors in life. So the definition that sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think that actually makes a lot of sense, because we were just having a conversation before we started about it. I was saying I'm losing my voice a little bit, and we were saying that I think it's probably unreasonable to want yourself or other people to never get any sort of illness or sickness, and it's quite natural to be under the weather at times, to get injured. But I suppose the important thing is whether you bounce back and whether you recover from it, or whether it sort of underlines more systemic issues that you can't recover from that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I just want to acknowledge that the definition that I'm talking about that I've been using within the book is called the Mykirk model of health. And I'm not sure if I've pronounced that correctly, but the authors are Bercha and Kuruvilla. And I think they've spent a lot of time, drawing from different theories and thinking about this, but it's a great perspective for those of us working in the built environment, because it brings in the social and environmental determinants within the definition and describing how those can be such an important part of giving us the resources that we need to deal with, day-to-day challenges that we may face.
Because you also bring in aspects of social equity and inclusion into the book as well, don't you?
Yeah, and it's a huge part of how we need to understand the built environment impact on health. That within cities and other environments, we aren't all working with the same set of factors that influence health. So it tends to be within cities that lower income neighborhoods and also neighborhoods with a greater number of racial and ethnic minority groups are those which are facing a higher burden of pollution, noise, air pollution, but also being in close proximity to hazardous facilities or industrial uses. And so it's not the case that we all kind of have this same opportunity to face day-to-day challenges or viruses or whatever sorts of factors may be coming at us, but that we have differential resources, and that those are not by chance, that those are on the basis of unfair decisions that have been taken over time.
So you introduce a framework in the book, which is the Thrives
Yes.
framework. Can you explain what that is and how it's useful?
Yeah, so kind of building on what I was saying earlier on that kind of sense that within urban planning and public health, we have taken too narrow a definition too narrow of an understanding of how the built environment affects health. I created the Thrives framework out of a specific advisory project that I was involved in a few years ago. And so it was a collaboration with Guy's and St. Thomas's Foundation. This is a 500-year-old charitable organization in South London. And their mission is to support the health and well-being of people living in Southwark and Lambeth. And they have a lot of property and land assets. And a few years ago, the director of their property team and their chief executive and other people in their team decided that they should be using those property and land assets to support health and well-being as part of their mission of their organization. And they brought me in as a kind of expert advisor through my role as being an academic to look at how we could support them to do that, and particularly in relation to a specific development that they were working on. And that's when I started the idea needing to develop the Thrives framework as a visual diagram to use in a discussion with people who are working at different decision-making stages within the built environment to talk about how a project will impact on health and well-being. And so through our early discussions, I started to develop, different versions of this model to explain the areas that I felt were important about how a new development or how decision-making within the built environment does affect health. And so the Thrives framework, it stands for Towards Healthy Urbanism, Inclusive, Equitable, Sustainable. And it is an inversion of traditional models, which are about how social determinants affect our health and well-being. The Thrives framework is not a model of all of the social determinants of health or of health generally. So it's not trying to explain all the factors that affect our health. It's really focused on how built environment and urban policy decisions affect health. And so a traditional model that a lot of people would know about is the Dahlgren and Whitehead rainbow model. And so it's shaped like a rainbow. It was a diagram developed in the early 1990s, and it explains how our health is affected. Individuals start just under the arch of the rainbow, if you can imagine. So there's a little picture of people, and their individual and genetic factors are at the core of that model. And then it broadens out to wider factors like social connections and behaviors and living and working environments and wider economic and social environments at larger scales. So people are at the center. And with the Thrives framework, I very intentionally inverted that model and put these three core intersecting principles of sustainability, equity, and inclusion at the core, alongside an inversion of the scales of health impact. So planetary health starts at the core. And the reason for doing that is to really emphasize the importance of our decisions on planetary health, and also the importance of addressing climate change and environmental degradation as a core imperative for people who are interested in health. Because if we don't have a healthy environment to live in, then it doesn't matter what kind of diet we're choosing, because we won't be able to survive the impacts of climate change. So planetary health is at the core, and it's really focused on those decision-making factors at a kind of city regional scale that would support planetary health. So thinking about zero carbon across different sectors, resource efficiency, thinking about a circular economy model, and biodiversity. So it's not just climate change, but other environmental degradation as well. And decisions that we take in terms of transport systems and energy for cities would affect those areas. And then the model, the Thrives framework, moves out in these interconnected circles. So we move out to decision making, which is perhaps smaller in scale, still could be at the city scale, but getting into districts and neighborhoods, which start to affect ecosystem health. And so with ecosystems, I'm thinking of air and water quality, soil quality, and green spaces within cities. So these can be factors that we address with urban policies, but also through designing spaces with green space and sustainable urban drainage systems and other infrastructure. And this will affect health more regionally. So if we pollute the water, this will have a regional health effect, but it can also start to spread, larger than a specific region when we think about air pollution, which can have a global impact. And then moving out through the Thrives framework, we go to that outer scale, which is local health. And that's where we look at neighborhoods and buildings, things like acoustic and thermal comfort, affordability, lighting and space within buildings. So it's a multi-scalar model of how urban environments affect health. And it thinks not only about spatial scales, but also temporal scales, so that decisions we make about, for example, sustainable energy systems on a particular building can affect health over decades through planetary health systems. And that may happen with the people who are living in that building, or it could happen across the world through planetary health in terms of climate change impacts.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'd really encourage people to go to your website, healthyurbanism.net, where you can actually see that diagram that you've been describing, because it is very effective. And actually having you talk through it while looking at it is really, really useful. So thank you for that. And just gives you a sense of just how holistic this is, from the planetary to the building level. What do you mean by planetary health in a sense? You mentioned there about zero carbon and that kind of thing. But I suppose what's the sort of tangible way I suppose people can interact with that concept?
So I think it would be a good idea if I read the definition of planetary health, because you might think of planetary health and think that it's about the health of the planet. So that it's not about human health, but that's not the case actually. And so just let me take one moment. Okay, so the Planetary Health Agenda is focused on the health impacts of anthropogenic environmental change. And through research and policy action, it aims to understand the interlinkages between health, civilization, and environmental degradation, adopt transformative actions, change governance systems through integrated policymaking, and reduce inequities. So there's a lot of different concepts going into that planetary health focus. And it's a whole area of research and also action. So thinking about not only studying the health impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, but also having that focus on inequities, understanding that the communities who've contributed the least to environmental degradation are the most likely to be affected, currently are the most affected in terms of climate change impacts. And we see that on really extreme scale in terms of sea level rise and communities being displaced, but also within a city like London, where lower income communities who've contributed the least to climate change will be heavily affected by not with being able to withstand overheating, as they can't adapt their house environment to cope with overheating. So it really impacts at lots of different scales. And that's what planetary health is about. And it's something that within public health practice and within our day-to-day understanding of healthy built environments, that's kind of been almost like a separate sustainability agenda that hasn't been a core focus. The Thrive framework and the model of healthy urbanism has tried to make it much more central and say this is a part of healthy urban design and planning, where the focus has been traditionally on thinking through physical activity and diets, like I was saying. Now I want to reorient our thinking to that global discussion on planetary health, which we now see has become something that we are all feeling and experiencing now through extreme weather events, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you get into that discussion of climate adaptation, I suppose at that point as well, of I think we've all felt the last few years the heat waves and the storms and, sudden drops in temperature, in December. London was hit by heavy snow and apparently nobody predicted. And, we're sort of finding the breaking points of our urban environments as we're starting to experience climate change. So
Yeah.
are you thinking a lot about climate adaptation now with this as well as being a health intervention?
Yes, absolutely. So I think one of the points that I make with the Thrive framework is that environmental degradation and climate change are causing health impacts which are here now. And so we need to use sustainable design as a public health intervention. And so we already have the knowledge about how to do sustainable design at different scales, different kinds of infrastructure. I worked, as I said, at the Building Research Establishment, which was the organization to develop BREEAM, the Sustainable Building and Sustainable Infrastructure Standard. And that was in the early 1990s. So decades of knowledge and experience within design and construction firms and supply chains. So we have the knowledge, we have the materials and the systems and the technologies, and it's not too expensive. So we've shown in lots of different markets that it's possible to do better, to go beyond current building regulations and create buildings which have a reduced impact on climate change, lower energy use within the building, at a cost which is not a significant increase over building to a standard code. So sometimes in certain sectors or certain markets, I should say, like in the UK, since around 2010, we have depended on developers to essentially address these through voluntary mechanisms. In some cases, local authorities have required BREEAM on non-residential buildings, but the residential sector has been a little bit left out as the Code for Sustainable Homes was set aside, even though we knew we could build to that standard without a significant cost increase. And so I think we can't rely only on the market to drive this kind of change, that we do need to have a range of carrots and sticks. And I'd really like to see public health come in as a supporter and a leader in this discussion to say, yes, sustainable design and construction is a public health intervention, and we need to use these policies to help us cope with a changing environment and to stop us from overshooting and not meeting our targets in terms of carbon mitigation.
Fantastic. Yeah. And it seems like a good time to maybe talk about some case studies. What sort of case
Absolutely.
studies do you bring up to illustrate this for people? Yeah.
So there's a few different models, and we were going to talk about, the building the business case. And I have some perspectives I'd love to share if we have time about the business case. I think there are a number of new models for how we can develop healthy and sustainable properties or new developments in a way that is effective both for developers, but also good for the people who are living and working in those spaces. One of the models is called the Nightingale Housing, and that's started out of Melbourne in Australia. And they were aiming for high sustainability and affordability. And both of those factors are important for health. So affordable housing, this is a crisis issue in many places around the world. And it plays out in different ways and the impacts that it has. But having an affordable house and having tenure security are really important for health and well-being. So the Nightingale Housing model looked to ensure affordability through a few different ways. They wanted to keep the costs of development low. So that would be through, for example, not having mechanical air conditioning, reducing the car parking spaces and others. other factors. And then by partnering with ethical investors who would have a 15% cap on the return. Another area of affordability was the running costs. So keeping those low through low cost renewable energy systems, having shared laundry facilities. But those kind of impacts would also be useful then for the environment and creating opportunities for social interaction, for example, at the shared laundry facilities. And then also over time, they built in affordability through having this covenant that restricts owners from selling the apartments on for more than the average price rise in the neighborhood. So it's not a perfect solution for affordability, but it's entirely separate to any kind of local government intervention. So they were completely doing this out of a private sector model. And then they've taken this model and they've continued to iterate it and develop new projects, which are residential and mixed use in Australia. But they have a lot of sustainability credentials, which are really exceeding what we consider to be normal on residential developments in terms of the energy that's required to service the properties for electricity use. They have on-site renewables. They have bicycle parking spaces and rainwater collection, which they use for irrigation and the common area toilets. So a lot of different measures there being good for sustainability and affordability, which I think is, coming together is a fantastic model for healthy housing.
I haven't heard of anyone making the connection between affordability and health before, but it makes perfect sense. Is that like a kind of a psychological, a mental health issue in terms of housing cost, not having a negative mental health
yeah, it's so
impact on
important.
people?
I think absolutely. It's interesting because when I started to develop the Thrives framework and I was having conversations with, peers, people in working in different countries in the space of healthy urban design and planning, and we were talking about how it wasn't easy to find the evidence base about affordable housing and health. That for some reason there hadn't been, you can find a huge number of studies about indoor air quality and health. That's something we know a lot about. We know all the solutions for that. But affordability was something where, drawing that connection and saying if you're living in unaffordable housing, if you don't have access to housing because it's too expensive, how does that result in health impacts? And there was actually a really helpful paper from my perspective by an academic called Mary Shaw in 2004. And she was describing the different ways that housing can impact on our health and well-being. And so it can be through these kind of physical or hard mechanisms, factors like indoor air quality and environmental quality within the housing. If you have mold or if you have pollution arising from materials in the house, that will have a direct impact on your health, for example, through some respiratory diseases. But there's also this other side, which she referred to as a softer, more meaningful side, which can relate to whether you have agency to change the property to be more comfortable for you. So if you don't have tenure security, or if you don't have the ability to change, put in curtains or install air conditioning to deal with overheating, or if you don't have what she referred to as ontological security, so that sense that you're in a safe space that you can stay in over time. And, as you have to deal with kind of demands on your life, going back to that Virtue and Kurovila model of health, say you lose your job and you're worried about not being able to stay in your house, the stress and the impact of that on your well-being will be huge. And that can have the trickle-down effects onto wider parts of your health. Depending on what kind of health system you're living in, it will certainly have an impact on your ability to pay for care as well.
I think that makes perfect sense. Yeah. And I think it's I think this is something for practitioners. It's important to hear, I think, because we often use when we're trying to convince clients of sustainable design or health and well-being measures, often the argument is, well, you can then charge a premium, or you'll get an additional percentage on what you can make from letting the space or selling the building. And I think, that's true in a sort of a free market, but it's the challenge with that is that these become just for, the middle and the upper classes and people who can afford it, and not for people, who need affordable spaces.
Exactly. And that's kind of one of the arguments I've made in the book. There's a big case on, or a big section within the book on the business case for healthy places. And it's something that we talk about a lot because we want to develop ways to convince people that they should be making decisions for healthy built environments. And sometimes that means selling the idea through a business case. And that could be, depending on who the decision maker is, if it's within local government and you want people to invest in some kind of infrastructure. The WHO has developed, for example, a health and economic assessment tool for transport. So you can plug into this tool. These are the transport and mobility infrastructure changes that we want to make in our city for walking and cycling infrastructure. And it will spit out some numbers about the economic savings that you will get as a result of the health benefits. So those kind of discussions are really important. But when we think about buildings and different kinds of buildings and who will be living and working in those, and then what's the business case, it becomes so much trickier. So if we talk about developers who are in the residential sector, they are looking for a return on investment over a really short time scale. And the financial benefit of a healthier building or a more sustainable building, may be cheaper to run. It may be that you spend less on health costs, and the benefits of that take place over a longer time period, but also they're dispersed across lots of different people. And so it's harder to make that argument. And I think it's fantastic to see the pandemic kind of spurred a change in thinking within real estate investment. So when I launched the book, the chair for the book launch was Yolanda Barnes, professor in the Bartlett Real Estate Institute. And she was talking about her experiences of discussions amongst investors who would invest in a range of real estate portfolios. And she said that in those meetings, they're saying, what's the social value of our investment? And they're more interested in that than they are in the bottom line right now. And I think there's just been a change that's happened over the last few years, so that will trickle down into decision-making by developers. And one of the case studies in the book, this actually happened. It was the Grow community in Bainbridge, Washington, which is not far from where I am here in Seattle. It's an island. And the investors on that project really drove the decision making because they said, we want this to be a development which is good for sustainability and it's affordable. So similar to the Nightingale housing model, they had the same goals of sustainability and affordability. And they were able to meet those, but it was also in their discussions with, I guess as they would think about focus groups with potential buyers of these new homes, people wanted to have sustainable properties, and they wanted to have properties which allowed them to have social connection. So it was meeting the needs in that market, and we will need lots of different models. So that worked in that place and time, but it wouldn't necessarily work in central London, or maybe it wouldn't work in other places where listeners are based. So I think a mixture of different models, sometimes incentives through planning systems, sometimes through changing the way that developers approach healthy and sustainable planning by focusing on those measures which are really cost effective, don't necessarily cost more, having the discussion earlier on in the design and planning process so that we can take, you can look at building orientation or layout measures which are not necessarily going to cost anything, but if we do them early enough can have a big impact on the outcomes.
Interesting. Yeah. And I would love to hear a bit more about maybe some more neighborhood scale or urban scale case studies, if you have any. And I'm particularly interested in this ecosystem aspect of it and the sort of, what we call nature-based solutions, although not always the best term, I think.
Yeah. I mean, one project that I was really excited about and a whole movement I'm excited about is co-housing. I don't know if you've been to any co-housing. Yeah. And I think from a health perspective, it's really promising because it's about stepping outside of these existing models for residential development, which aren't working in so many places. And so a group of people come together. If people aren't familiar with co-housing, it can be done in different ways. But a group of people come together and are interested in doing a group self-build project. and they may have assistance, for example, by a local authority that's already set aside land or set through a policy and development process where they will support groups. But other groups will be doing this without such support in place. And they put in place a plan to build a new residential project, which can be lots of different scales. Some of the projects that I've seen are quite small. But one example I wanted to talk about is Marmalade Lane in Cambridge, in the UK. And this has 42 houses and then shared gardens and communal spaces. And I took our master's students, so I run a master's program in health, wellbeing, and sustainable buildings. And I took the students there last year as our field trip. I think it's a fantastic example of healthy and sustainable design. And the story of this project goes back quite a while before the group came together to actually build Marmalade Lane. The counselors within this part of Cambridge had gone to Vauban in Germany on a study tour. And Vauban is known amongst people in sustainable urbanism as part of Freiburg, near Freiburg, that is a kind of exemplar of sustainable design and sustainable urbanism. And that was inspired by the Baugruppen model within Germany, where groups of people come together and do self-build. And within the German system, it's very supported through local government. And some of the academic research in this space has shown that these self-build projects are really good for affordability, social connection, and inclusive design, because you get economies of scale, and because people are coming together, they decide and they build that space in ways that will work for them. And they do have usually an interest in, some kind of social spaces. So at Marmalade Lane, they had an existing group of people who were interested in having co-housing. And after the counselors had gone to Vauban and been inspired by their study tour, a number of things happened where the land became available and the co-housing group were involved in reviewing and scoring bids and setting up little design teams within their group to work on, kitchens or different design decisions within the project. And they were able to make slight adjustments within each of the houses. They're not all identical, but they also negotiated with the developer on things like not using gas boilers, but having air source heat pumps. So they would have a more sustainable source for heating. And the space and the vibe of the place when you get there is just really calming and very inviting. There's trees, there's landscaping everywhere. The street space that goes down between two rows of housing in a typical development would have remained a street space, but the community took the decision to close that off for cars. So it's still accessible for emergency vehicles, but they don't park their cars there, and they use that as a shared play space for kids and kind of hangout space for people. And they have a lot of shared facilities that just make sense in modern life. So they have a maker space and tool shed. So you don't need to have everybody buying their own, identical sets of tools in their own garage. And they have shared gym space and outdoor gardens and a trampoline, and just it was really fantastic. And I think from the healthy urbanism perspective, thinking about the importance of social connection, and I hope that we do mitigate against climate change, but as we start to feel the impacts of increased extreme weather events, we need to have social connection and networks as a part of our resilience to these environmental threats. When we experience overheating, we need to check on our neighbors and make sure that they're doing okay. And when we live in an environment where we know our neighbors and we have these communal spaces and resources, it just makes that a lot easier. So I think they're a fantastic model for disrupting some of the development processes that we have that aren't working for people or the planet.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of co-housing, and I have a theory about co-housing of why it works so well, which is that I've been doing this series on the podcast called Primal City, which explores how what urban designers can learn from human evolution. And my feeling about co-housing is that it very closely mimics our sort of prehistoric way of living in tribes of, sort of 50 to 150 people, extended families, everyone sharing resources, that very tight-knit community. And yet in modern cities, we kind of insulate ourselves and we live in individual boxes and stay separate from other people, which feels very contrary to our nature and how we evolved for hundreds of thousands of years. So yeah, I think that's
Absolutely.
yeah. I would love to see co-housing coming out of that niche, because it's still so rare, particularly in the UK. Do you have any thoughts on how that, maybe going back to business cases and funding models, how do we make this more mainstream?
Yeah, I think that there's been a lot of interest in co-housing. Certainly in London, a number of organizations are working in this, and they're much more familiar with the specific changes that need to take place. I know that some local authorities are making land available, but I've also heard that then the land that they do make available is, sometimes a really awkward site, for example, next to some, rail lines and, in a space that's not very nice. And so there's still a lot of room that we can improve and make this an option that is more viable. I think there's a little bit of a hesitance for some people that it's like, oh, it's a commune or it's socialism.
Yeah.
There's a kind of almost ideological, political view on that. And I'm not sure why, because as you said, I think going back, if you go on holiday and you visit a beautiful Mediterranean village and you love all those parts about how walkable it is and how, intergenerational it is, but then you want to go back to wherever you're living and it's not like that. It doesn't have to be, I think, an ideological heavy approach, but I feel like coming from seeing where we are in the States right now, that that would be seen as a really radical approach. In the UK, it's a little bit less radical, but still on the outskirts. So it's about, making it possible. There's regulatory challenges in the US because of zoning and single family housing zoning, yes, and wouldn't allow this kind of uses to take place. But I think that those things are changing slowly. And like you said, with the intergenerational benefits, I think those are so important as we deal with new threats and different kinds of threats. Loneliness is a huge health challenge for us, that as we live longer, because medicine has been so successful at keeping us alive for longer, we have decades where we're retired or we're not seeing people, we're not leaving the house. And if we're living on our own, it's a horrible existence. And so creating environments which are better for intergenerational living, it could be through designing the urban streetscape in a way that allows you to get to know your neighbors, but it could also be through models of housing which build in that intergenerational aspect.
Yeah, I think a really interesting question around this is when people actually retrofit existing buildings and existing areas for more of a co-housing model. And I've heard of examples where you have sort of suburban houses and groups of neighbors have decided to take down their fences and just share their backyards. And there's ways you can do this without having to sort of redevelop everything, which is really
definitely
cool.
Absolutely. I agree. I think those kind of examples where, you just take down the fences and then the kids have all that space to roam and, the dogs and everything. It's fantastic.
So good. Yeah. Do we want to pick up on anything before we move on to our final question?
I wanted to say something about the business case, because it's such an important discussion point. And we were talking about how we need to find different ways to make sure that the return on investment works for different types of developers. And I think it also requires us to completely upend our understanding of development models. Like we were saying, there's new models that we need to have. But if we rely on existing models, we should be aware that they aren't necessarily going to drive us in the direction of the healthiest type of development. So there's a lot of unintended consequences that would come through keeping a business as usual approach. And one of the things is that developers are only likely to consider the direct financial benefits of the investments that they make. So they won't be looking at the wider impacts to neighbors or over time of the different technologies or design measures that they put in place. And so these premiums for healthier development aren't going to be consistent across property types and tenures. So it might be possible to build really healthy luxury homes, and wealthy people can afford to buy them, but that won't work in kind of shared housing or more affordable housing tenures. Or it might be possible within workspaces that large companies are building for attracting the best talent, that they will build healthy workspaces, but that won't necessarily work in public sector school buildings, where we need to make sure that our kids are studying and learning in healthy places. So we can't just rely on that development model in terms of a direct financial benefit to the developer. The other side of that is that the design measures that are good for value, that in other words, people perceive there to be a benefit that they're willing to pay for, aren't always those which are most aligned to health. So biophilic office design is something which a lot of people are really interested in and potentially willing to pay more for, because they feel the office space is good for well-being, and again, maybe helps to attract talent into their workspace. And that may be good for health and well-being, but it may not be as important as good ventilation. So if we were comparing those two measures, we say some biophilic elements versus a really high-functioning ventilation system, the ventilation system is evidence-based to be really important for health in terms of protecting us against infectious diseases, not only something like COVID, but also just day-to-day flu and other viruses, cold viruses, et cetera, which is really important for our health and well-being. But also exposure to indoor air pollutions arising from materials and furnishings and paints and everything like that. But we can't see that good ventilation. It doesn't necessarily give us that feel good, I'm in a biophilic office space, and therefore we may not necessarily assign value to it. So there's a mismatch between the things which we might be willing to pay more for and those things which are really most aligned with our health and well-being. So those are a couple of the points I wanted to raise, and also just emphasizing that, the impact on inequities, that charging higher rates is going to have a negative impact on the communities that can't afford to pay those, which, could be lower income groups. And there are a lot of inequalities and, impacts on that will ripple through to different parts of our communities.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd be interested to know about your thoughts on the certification standards like WELL and FitWell and that kind of thing, which are growing a lot, actually. Yeah.
And I have addressed those in the book. And I think that, we've done some research on how people have been applying those standards in new development. And I think it's important. They do play an important role in raising understanding about health and well-being. And that's great. WELL and FitWell are very different, developed in different ways and applied in different ways. They can both be applied with sustainable construction standards as well, like BREEAM and LEED. And I think it's good that they've taken the effort to line those up. But I also think using multiple certification systems is expensive. And particularly right now, where the WELL building standard is relatively new. And so it's still expensive for projects to pay for the consultancy and the materials that are required to meet those standards. And so that just means that the number of projects and the types of projects that will be able to implement those are likely to be higher end and fewer projects. And I think that we do need to have better understanding within curriculum on the built environment about how to implement good design that is good for health and sustainability as just a normal part of our architecture and planning and urban design curriculum, rather than a niche side area that some interested students will take. It should be much more foundational and fundamental part of the curriculum.
Great. Yeah. I'll take us on to our final question, which is something I've borrowed from Rob Hopkins, who is a previous guest on the podcast, and he has his own podcast, which is all about the power of the imagination. So the question is that I want you to transport yourself forward to the year 2050 and imagine that, the things we've talked about sustainability, about health and well-being, have people have taken action on them and we've made progress on them. Looking that far into the future, can you tell us what would the world be like for you if we got that right?
Yeah, I love this question. I'm a little bit pessimistic by nature, and I probably had never taken the time to even let myself imagine what the world would look like if we had, mitigated and adapted to climate change. And it's just really exciting to think about a future where that has happened. And I've tended to focus on a more dystopian future where it didn't. So I think there's so many health benefits if we've managed to do this in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And I'll just pick up on a few. So with mitigation, one of the things that we would have done if we had mitigated effectively against climate change by 2050 would be we'd significantly curbed air pollution. So we've stopped burning fossil fuels for powering our transport and our buildings, and that goes across many different parts of the different sectors. Air pollution is responsible for around 9 million deaths annually around the world, and it does affect people in different ways. So younger people and older people are more vulnerable. But as I was saying earlier, within cities, the people living in the most polluted parts of cities in terms of air pollution are usually those on lower incomes or of racial and ethnic minority groups. So it's a very unfair exposure and resulting in health inequities. So fantastic if we've managed to curb that. Over the next 30 years, I think it would have been possible that we could have done this by reducing single occupancy motor vehicle trips, for example. I mean, this would be one thing we would have to change in many cities in order to significantly curb air pollution. And so we would have cities that are designed for walking and cycling and public transport. And this would have so many fantastic health benefits. But I think just putting ourselves in, what would that look like in my life? It would be easier to get physical activity in my day-to-day life because I could safely walk and cycle with my kids to school or on my way to work. I'd have less back pain because, think chronic back conditions and other challenges that we have as we get older in life. A lot of it is about not having enough physical activity. And we would feel happier because physical activity increases our happiness, and we wouldn't be, feeling so much back pain, for example. We'd be spending less money on maintaining our cars and fueling them, and spending more time with the people that we love because we'd be able to, do active transport like walking our kids to school, which is, fantastic. So I think huge benefits just on one specific example of mitigation. And so it's a fantastic thing to imagine, but it would just ripple through to so many other areas like stress and obesity and getting enough sleep. So it'd be fantastic. Another side of this coin on adaptation, I think if we've done this, it means that we would have accepted as a society that racism and discrimination have led to unfair climate impacts. And that's around the world. But, we would have to look at that even within, really at a granular level within cities. So we would have given money directly to communities who have been historically targeted with industry and transport infrastructure, leaving them exposed to air pollution and overheating risks. And so local government would have worked directly with community-based organizations to spend that money according to local need to make housing improvements and new parks. And this would be part of climate adaptation, but it would be in recognition that some groups within society are unfairly exposed to the key impacts, the worst impacts of climate change. And this would have so many health benefits in terms of individuals' agency, sense of agency and control over their circumstances to change their environment and stay in places which are meaningful, communities and physical places that are meaningful to people. So I really look forward to this future. I hope we can make it happen. And I think it's possible. There's so many. I think one of the closing points would be that we really do have the solutions. And at this point, it's about finding the agreement and the political will to make them happen.
Excellent. I love that. Thank you. You're the first guest I've asked this question to, so you were a bit of a guinea pig, and but that was fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and we'll keep asking more guests.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's been a really good chat. I've really enjoyed this. I'll make sure to leave links to everything about you in the episode description. But if you want to tell people how they can find you or learn more about your work.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ross, for having me. I've really enjoyed this, and I am happy to give you a few links to more information about my research, where, on my institutional webpage and the healthyurbanism.net website.
Excellent. Sounds good. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.